This is House Planning Help, episode 391. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build or retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, Jeffrey Hart returns to the podcast, and we're talking earth floors. Over the years, we've mentioned Grand Designs on and off the TV show. In fact, we've even interviewed Kevin MacLeod, if you want to dig back into the archive. We're going to mention it today because Jeffrey has a great claim to fame. This is probably one of their most famous episodes. I seem to remember Kevin MacLeod himself loved this house in the end, but I can imagine what it must have been like on day one, where they look at those plans and they think, this is a bit crazy. It's one man attempting to build this huge, great house. It had a great hall, this massive cathedral-style window. It was a timber frame, and this guy was skilled. This is Ed Waghorn and his wife, Rowena. A lovely project, but you just thought, they're never going to get there. He'll give up at some point. But this highlights one of the traits that will always see you through, and that's determination. Even without massive funds, if you're determined and you've got skills, you will get there eventually. And that's exactly the lesson that came out of this. Maybe his kids had grown up and left home by the time he was getting towards the end. And it was a good decade or so, wasn't it? I bet there were a few small jobs round the back that still needed to be completed. But Jeffrey's claim to fame is to have one of his earth floors within this building. So fantastic. Let's get to our featured interview with Jeffrey Hart from the Earthen Floor Company. And that is exactly what we're focusing on today, these earth floors. And I started my conversation by asking him when he first started learning about earth floors.
My initial training was out in the States, in Oregon, where there's a big natural building scene. And I was very fortunate to be trained by Sukita, who is largely credited with carrying earthen floors in sort of this generation. And yeah, so I trained with her and then have sort of every project going forward. When I was out in the States, I lived out there for 5 years, and every project had an earth floor in it, and so I got more and more into them. And once I got home to the UK, just people had heard that I was the person that knew how to do this and would ask. And I had sort of no intention of it becoming my speciality, but just the requests kept coming in, and I was building whole houses, always kind of natural materials focused, so lots of straw, lots of clay, lots of hemp, stuff like that. Yeah, but slowly the floors have kind of taken over, and I've really enjoyed actually going from a generalist to really focusing on just one thing and really kind of honing that product and that technique. So earth floors are pretty much all I do at the moment.
You mentioned as well that the lady that had taught you is almost carrying that methodology. Does that mean that there's been a big decline in earth floors? Because I'm assuming there's a big history of them.
Yes. Well, I mean, the history of earth floors is quite sort of interesting, really. So many buildings would have had an earth floor just because it was the ground beneath their building. Houses were built with very small foundations, if any, and the floor would have actually just been the compacted earth that was always there. And then at some point people realise, the earth beneath, say, a floor with animals in, they realise that got harder because something in the cow dung would react with the earth and make it a harder, more waterproof surface. And so, that was a thing that was added to earth floors deliberately to add durability. And they'd also realised that often sort of old farm buildings have a slaughtering room, and earth floors in there where the blood was spilled on it got really rock solid hard. And so, yeah, various different places around the world have got these different methods of hardening an earth floor. And what Sukita really did, she championed I think I'm right in this. I'm slightly concerned that I'm changing the story, but certainly she has been working with a way of using linseed as the sealing, so getting away from the blood and the dung, so it's quite a lot more palatable. But yeah, she's really been pushing this sort of linseed option. And so really it's taking the floor that probably everyone except very rich people would have had and making it suitable for the modern world and the way we live now.
Now, forgive me for really basic questions here, but even if we talk about the word floor, what is the floor? Is this just the finish that we're going to have in our houses, or can this be structural?
It can be either. So at the very minimum, we can install a 20 mil top coat of earth, and that can be installed over existing concrete or limecrete floors. It can be installed over suspended timber floors even. So that's kind of the very minimum. We can just apply the finish. Another option is that we do the full build up. And so the preferred method that we use is to have foam glass insulation, the sort of granules, and then we can put underfloor heating in that on top of the insulation. And then we can ram in earth using a kind of dryish mix that's whackered in. And that forms a very rammed earth, solid mass chunk that ends up being very similar to a sort of limecrete slab or something like that, just a little bit softer. And then that can take a 20 mil top coat again. So the top coat is a poured finish. It's troweled, smooth, and there's a really sort of fine finish. And if you go for the full build up, that slab underneath is quite a rough, textured finish that isn't really suitable to be your final floor, but is the perfect thing to take that little top coat.
I imagine we all want insulation underneath our floors these days. So do you find that is the general approach, the foam glass, or are you dealing with all sorts?
Definitely insulation. That's part of the modern earth floor is knowing that we need insulation, and in certain areas you might need a membrane if there's damp issues, things like that. I favour foam glass because it's a capillary break. It doesn't allow moisture to travel upwards. And that's a really good thing. We want our inside space to stay really dry. So foam glass is definitely my preferred choice. We have installed over PIR all of the standard insulations. As long as they are load bearing, we can do it. It's just, you've got to think, with an earth floor, one of the things you've got to be really careful of is moisture. And it's initially a kind of clay plaster that's laid, and then when that's dried, it's saturated with linseed oil. And the linseed, if there's too much moisture in the ground or in the surrounding walls, the linseed can't actually polymerize, which is the process of it forming long chain molecules and becoming a really solid, hard-wearing, durable finish. So if there is moisture issues, then the floor will never quite reach that hardness, which obviously isn't ideal. So yes, insulation wise, that's why I would tend towards foam glass, just because it's better at dealing with the moisture.
And earthen floor, is there any difference there?
No. So there's different people around the world will call it different things. Some people would call it a cob floor. Some people will call it a rammed earth floor. Some people might call it adobe floor. I mean, it's worth saying that so an earth floor is sort of comparable in process to a concrete or a limecrete floor, in that it is a binder and it is aggregate and it is fibre. So in our case, the binder is clay, which is, a very abundant resource, certainly around the UK, but its stickiness, or the strength it can hold together, is lower than that of, say, lime or cement. That's why we need to add this final oil. It turns it from something that's relatively soft and quite easily damageable to this hard-wearing, almost like a sort of a leathery rock. I don't know. It's one of those things where the actual feeling of it is very difficult to describe. Because of its similarity in the way it's installed, it's poured and troweled, and the makeup of it, it's often compared to concrete and limecrete. But actually the finish, what you're standing on, is much more comparable to a wooden floor. There's this ever so slight softness to it. It's got a little tiny bit of give in it. So that kind of feeling, I imagine everyone's kind of stood for a long time on a concrete floor and it makes your joints ache. that doesn't really happen as much with an earthen floor. It's much more like standing on a wooden floor where it's comfortable.
It's the natural feeling, isn't it? That's what we like about natural buildings, is you just get this extra sense.
Yes, very much so. Part of that as well is the sound, because it's slightly softer. Echoes are softened. And then visually as well, because of the method that it has to be installed, it's touched by human hand. You know, it's that beautifully lime plastered wall that's flat, but it's got a little tiny gentle movement. I mean, we're talking fractions of a millimetre, but it's enough to be not that kind of laser flat industrial thing that leaves you feeling a bit cold.
So any other pros and cons that we should point out?
Well, I mean, the pros, certainly one of the big things, if you are comparing an earthen floor to a concrete floor or a limecrete floor, embodied carbon reductions, it's about an 83% reduction if you were to swap like for like. And that's based on a calculator, an emissions calculator from Beam, which is a Canadian company. And they are the only people who actually have earth floors as one of their kind of drop downs. We are working on our own emissions calculations at the moment, but as a sort of an idea, an 83% reduction in emissions is pretty substantial. The other pros, it can be so hyper local in terms of what the materials are. Quite often we'll have people digging their foundations and they'll say, we're digging out huge amounts of clay. We can test that clay and use it to put back in as your flooring. We can use a local sand as well, and so you're really reducing any of the sort of travel material sort of transport is what I'm saying. But also, you know, you're creating a floor that is your floor of your place. Clays around the country are very different, sands around the country are very different. How lovely to have a thing that is your exact region kind of reconfigured to be this beautiful functional floor.
You mentioned about taking samples of the soil to the lab. What is that looking for?
Well, first of all, clay and silt are quite often confused. Clay normally works well as a building material, and silt doesn't. So we've had people say, you know, we've dug all of this wonderful clay, they've sent it to me and I've tested it and it's silt. So it's not suitable, unfortunately. But what I am testing for when I've determined that it's clay is the amount of shrinkage. So depending on the types of rocks that were chemically eroded over, you know, millions of years ago and created this clay, they all have different rates of shrinkage, they have different strengths. And so what I am doing when I'm testing is finding out what is the ratio so that it doesn't shrink too much and so that the clay has enough strength to hold everything together. And there's a kind of sweet spot in the middle which will work really nicely as a floor.
And if you test one area, do you have to test the other area as well? Is there a lot of variation or not really in a given location?
That's a good question. One of the things we stipulate if people are going to use their own clay is that it needs to be dug up. You know, a good excavator will see when they break through a different layer of clay, and they can happen next to each other or sometimes below each other, and you'll tend to get a different colour and a different texture. So there is a slight difficulty in that people need to be aware when they're digging out their clay. You know, if two different types were mixed in together, we could end up having inconsistent results, which obviously in a floor you don't want.
When you talk about going further afield to look for your clay, are you talking about a company that might refine it, or is it just starting again in a field?
Yes, so most of our floors, due to time constraints and cost, they use our pre-bagged mix, and that uses clay from a few different places. We use a brickyard in Buckinghamshire. Well, there's a couple of different brickyards around the country that we can get clay from. We can also use a kind of pottery clay, and they all change slightly the colour that you get.
Well, we'll probably come back to that in a minute. So I'm interested, do I bring up cost now? You talked about this lovely story that would be great, wouldn't it? That we're in our given location, we want our floor to be authentic, but I'm sensing that adds to the cost and probably the time of the research and everything that needs to go into it.
Yes, unfortunately so. And I really wish it wasn't the case, because for me, that is the ultimate flaw, using your local material. But the reality is that there's a whole testing process. There's a processing of the material. We can't just use it as it comes out of the ground. We either need to make it very wet or we need to dry it out fully. And also, it adds in a degree of variability. When we're using our pre-bagged clays, they're going to be the same every time. Like, we know our exact ratio, we know how they're going to install. When you're using a local clay, there's a bit more variation possible, which adds risk, which unfortunately needs to be accounted for financially. So the sad reality is that yes, it does cost more to use your local material. And people they'll phone me up and they'll say, what's our price? Great. And how much do we save when we use our material? And it's like, unfortunately, that's not the way it works.
Yes, they're thinking they're going to make a saving. No. Coming back to pros and cons then, because I'm not sure we got all the way through that. Any others you want to chuck in?
I sort of touched on it earlier, but it works beautifully with radiant heat. So underfloor heating, either you can use the electric type or you can use the water type. And earth has a really great heat storage capacity. It holds it slightly longer than, say, a concrete floor would. So you don't tend to get that shocking cold that you can get sometimes when a concrete floor has cooled right down. To me, it's the absolute ultimate. Having a nice warm earthen floor under your feet is really quite the feeling.
And which layer would you put your underfloor heating in?
So if you're doing the full earth build up, then I would have it usually between the insulation and the base coat. So we do about 100 mil of rammed earth. Some people choose to have it in the midpoint of their base coat. The lower down the pipes go, the longer it takes to heat up the mass. If it's your home and you're going to be heating it regularly and you're going to be in the house regularly, then it's not so much of an issue to have the heat at the bottom of your slab. But it might be a holiday home or something like that, and the building will sit cold for a longer time. And so they sometimes will put the heating pipes further up in the slab, and that means that you get a quicker response when you put the heating on, and it's not a couple of hours till it's warmed up. It's a much shorter, more responsive thing.
And I've heard as well, talking about time there for a moment, that is one of the challenges when you finish your earth floor, is that it takes time to dry out.
Yes, very much. That is definitely a limitation that I always discuss with people. So from start to finish, if everything goes well, it's 3 weeks from install to you being able to use the floor. The first stage of drying the floor is actually just evaporating all of the moisture out of the clay. And so with that, we're putting it on heaters, we're blowing fans across. That obviously in the middle of summer will dry a lot quicker than in the middle of winter. If it's a hot, windy day, it's going to dry quicker than a cold, calm, dry, wet day. So there's definitely a bit of it depends in the time it takes. And once the floor is dry, we then come in and oil it. And that is 2 weeks until it's hard, or 10 days until it's very sort of light traffic hard. And the oil is always logarithmic. It's a logarithmic curve, as in, it gets hard quickly at the beginning, and then there's a long tail of it slowly getting harder and harder and harder and reaching its final hardness. So you do have to be a little bit careful of it at the beginning. And so normally saying that you can't walk on it for a month is a good baseline. Sometimes we can get on it quicker, but there definitely is some time. When we're working for clients who are self-builders, that's never normally a problem. It becomes an issue when there's a main contractor, and the main contractor is, the floor is often one of the last things to go in, and they're pushing, time is money. And so we always come up against main contractors pushing us like, what can we do to speed this up? What can we do? And generally speaking, what I've observed is when people try and speed it up and really force it, then accidents happen. People will try and run dehumidifiers to speed up the drying, and invariably they will leak, and then you've got a floor that then needs repairing, and that slows everything down.
And have you got any suggestions for the contractor at that point? Can they start on their next job, for example?
Well, there's always a discussion about what gets done. Quite often there'll be something to do outside, or there'll be upstairs, or, whatever it is. As long as the conversation's had right at the beginning, then it can be scheduled for, so that it's not a surprise and people can plan around it.
And I understand the speeding up thing. Is there any sense that the more naturally you let it dry, the better? Or, even in the summer, could that cause problems if it was a heat wave of 40 degrees?
Part of my process when I'm creating the mixes is to make them really resilient to all the factors. And part of that is drying too quickly. So I'm actually really confident with the way that I can make my mixes, that I can blast hot air at them and they dry without any problems. The issue would be that on a very, very hot day, if we were installing, it's like with plastering, it's like when you colour in with a felt tip pen. You always want to keep that leading edge wet, otherwise you can tend to see the trowel marks. So with a very wide floor, say, on a very hot day, it can be quite tricky to keep everything wet because everything wants to dry out quickly. So in those instances, we might need to look at shading. We might need to really wet down the floor beforehand. We might need to bring in more people so that we're always kind of moving forward and we're not letting things dry out as we install.
And that would be similar to lime rendering and clay plasters,
Yes.
things like that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's exactly the same.
What about the embodied carbon of all the drying? Is that relevant at all, or not really?
I mean, it is. It's definitely relevant. It's one of those things where if the client has the time, then absolutely fine, But the reality is that people want to be using their floor, and they want to be getting it done as quickly as possible.
It always surprises me, even in a traditional masonry building, that it can go on drying for a good year or so, and I imagine the floor might be similar.
Yeah, it's a consideration in that if everything in the house has been replastered, there's a lot of moisture that's been brought in, and everything is slowly drying out. It can definitely affect the floor if everything is wet. And I've talked to people who have done Enefit renovations, and they said, the performance of their building wasn't as good as they thought it would be right at the beginning. And that turned out to be because, everything was sort of drying out.
And let's just rewind for a moment into how this all happens. What would the process look like? We come to you. Yes, we'd like an earth floor. What is actually going to happen? The planning stages, on site, anything that we need to know about?
So it always starts with a discussion. We talk about all of the things that we need to know, or you need to know. You send over some plans to me. One consideration is the shape of your building. Say if you had an L-shaped room, then where the change in direction happens around the L, that is a weak point. And so we might need to look at dividing the two rooms into two kind of rectangles. So sending through plans lets me check over the details and see that there's not anything extra we need to deal with in the sort of lead up. Generally speaking, people will prepare their own sort of subfloors, and then we will arrive on site with our team. And the aim for us is we always want to get a floor done in a day, so start to finish. It's quite a labour intensive process. An installer will do about 10 square metres a day. So obviously if you've got a 50 square metre room, then we need to bring in 5 installers to get through it. We don't want to leave anything overnight. You can get a sort of tide mark, just a sort of aesthetic line, which I don't like. So yes, that's we'll kind of blast through it as quickly as we can when we're on site. Then fans, heaters, whatever the drying methods are then left. And at some point, the client will call me and say, yes, we're ready. The floor has changed colour. I will come back to site and then I will oil it. That takes about a day. And then after 2 weeks, I will come back again. And this time I give the floor a buff. So go over with a floor buffer just to soften the surface a little bit. And then I apply a coat of wax. And that's us done.
And when you're mixing it in the first place, is this just in a cement mixer equivalent?
Yeah, so it's a forced action mixer, which is commonly what's used to mix lime. I think the mixer I use is generally actually used for a one of those acrylic, what do they call it? Resin driveways. I think that's the main use of the mixers that we use. But they work great for mixing clay and lime. So yeah, it's kind of a big ice hockey puck shaped mixer with spinning blades. If you try to use a cement mixer, it is possible, but the only way to get it to mix properly is to make the mix very wet, which actually then wouldn't be good to install. It would you'd have a really hard time getting it flat, getting it smooth. So this way we can control the moisture and get a really good homogeneous mix.
And given your product that you've been talking about, is that almost the trade secret, the ratios of all these different components?
Yes, yeah, I'd say so. I mean, that's the thing I've spent years honing, is really what our ratios are and how far we can push them, and how wet we make the mix, and things like that. So I've never thought of that as a trade secret.
So when you get to the end of this process, because of that, you're fairly confident this is always going to go the right way. We're not going to have any issues.
Yes, I am. And it's because of this constant testing and changing of the mix that's happened over all these years. It used to be when I first started doing them, I was very nervous about how it was going to go. I'd have a couple of weeks of no sleep after it was installed. And that was what really led to the change to make it a lot more of a product, was just that, I needed consistency and the clients needed consistency. It was beneficial for everyone.
Once it's all done, how long would we expect it to last? And when it comes to the end of that life, will it start to flake, or how will it go?
Well, my earliest floors in this country are 10 years old. I'm thinking of one floor in particular. What's happened to that is as it's been walked over constantly, it's slowly smoothed itself out. It's actually become really, really beautiful. It's sort of changing over time. Yeah, it's not going to flake. I would expect you'd get 30 years of life out of a floor easily. And the issues might happen if you, say, drop something really heavy, the corner of a bit of furniture, of a really heavy sofa or something, in which case, where you've got a dent or a chip, if that's not repaired, then they can tend to, because you've got edges there that can catch, you might get more damage growing out from that. But repairing's super easy. When we finish installing a floor, we will make up little biscuits. So with the mix that's left over, we'll make up little biscuits. They get dried out. The homeowner keeps them in a little box somewhere. If there's any damage, you can crumble up one of those biscuits, mix it with some oil, smear it in your crack or in your dent. There you go. That's it. Sealed, finished, and repaired. It should be said that the repairs are quite hard to make completely seamless. I mean, I've got pretty good over the years, but in the right light or the right angle, you can see a repair, which I think some people really, really like.
I was just going to say that
kind of story. Yeah, it's they like the story. They like, this is where my kid dragged his bike across the floor, or whatever it was. But in terms of it being a functional floor, it will last 30 years, I would say, easily. Someone described it to me as like your new pair of leather shoes. When you've got them, you love their pristineness, and that first scuff you put on them, you're devastated. But then, years down the line, it's all the scuffs and it's the it's the worn in, it's the stories that actually you kind of end up loving about them. And I think that's the feeling that you can get with the floor. While we're sort of talking about repairs and kind of living with them functionally, they end up as a hardness somewhere between a hardwood and a softwood floor. And so things like very heavy furniture with little tiny legs, those little pin leg chairs, that could cause damage to your floor. So I'd always recommend that your furniture has nice wide legs. You stick felt pads under it, exactly the same as you do to keep your wooden floor in its pristine condition. The example that's always used is stilettos. So that kind of point load, that's where you can cause damage.
Is there anything you don't want to spill on it? A glass of red wine? Probably you wouldn't want to do this on a wooden floor either.
Well, yes. Do you know what? I've not actually spilt any wine on the floor. Maybe that's something I should do. It's that's a thing that we haven't actually said, is that there's an assumption that because it's earth, you can't get it wet. But actually the oiling completely changes the surface of the material. And while you wouldn't want to flood the floor, for example, like when you're mopping it, you want to use a damp mop. You wouldn't want to chuck a bucket of water and push the water around. They do take quite a lot of moisture before they would start to soften. And people do in fact use them in bathrooms, in kitchens. You just have to be aware that, spillages need to be mopped up. And then if there's something major like a flood, I've had one customer who flooded their bathroom twice, to the point where I think they only noticed when water was coming through the ceiling below. So quite a major flood. But they dried it out. They put fans, heaters, dehumidifiers in there, and the floor is totally fine. It's completely functional. They said there's a ever so slight movement in the floor where it's kind of wobbled a little bit, but considering it was underwater, it's held up incredibly well.
So is the colour of these floors always the same, or is that something that can change?
So colour is something especially I deal with when architects are specifying these. We can change the colour slightly. So the reason we use different clays is because you can get different colour clays. We've got a lovely burgundy clay, we've got a nice bright orange one, we've got this grey clay. And so they will tend to change the colour of the floor. But there's a limiting factor in this, in that your oil, so the oil that really makes the floor, that's a kind of golden brown colour. And I apply lots of coats of this to really saturate the floor and make it really durable. So the floor will tend towards a brown colour. So you can have this sort of reddy brown or the grey brown or the orangey brown. If you want to choose different colours, there are two options. One is we can put pigment in the mix. So we had one customer who wanted this kind of plum colour. So we pigmented the floor. Yeah, really beautiful plum colour. It's got that browny tone to it. That's one option. That means that the colour goes right the way through the floor. If people want a lighter colour, so some people want a very bright, a white or a cream colour, then we can use a coloured hard wax on the top. So that goes on the top, sets nice and hard. That is only a surface finish, so it might be every couple of years you might need to reapply that, and that's just you paint it on. That's a sort of standard product. In fact, it's an Osmo, so it's pretty universal. But that means that you can have a very, very bright colour, which is suitable for some rooms. You might not want a darker colour, so you get all the the benefits and the lovely feeling and the way it handles light, but with that sort of brighter tone.
Do most people go for just the natural colour?
Well, it's sort of changed over the years. We used to have, mostly it was self-builders that we'd be working with, and generally they loved the natural tone. As they've got more popular and interior designers are starting to specify them, or architects are starting to specify them, people are becoming more choosy, I guess, about their sort of colours, and that they want a bit more control over it. So it's definitely changing. Personally, I love the natural colours. For me, I really like things which are honest. They're the way they are because of everything that goes into them. Things pretending to be other things isn't really my deal, but I also don't have any problem with people that want to change the colour.
Now, going back to your mix and so forth, so is everything sorted out? We've got clay, we've got the aggregate, the sand, we've got the fibre and the oil. All of those things are, it's just your way of doing it, or is there ever any fluctuation?
One thing to say is about the fibre. We can use a fibre that is visible, which is generally straw, like a chopped straw. Some people love that aesthetic, some people don't. Or we can use an invisible fibre, like a hemp, which you can't see in the mix at all. So that's a change in aesthetic. Totally down to client preference. Doesn't really matter either way in terms of how the mix is. But pretty much that is a consistent thing. Sometimes, and this is for very special clients, you can ferment the mix, and to some people that would sound horrible and they won't want anything to do with it. In the clay plastering world, a fermented mix is one of the most beautiful things, because you actually ferment the straw and the fibres, and they break down in the mix and create a gluey, kind of glutinous substance that actually makes the floor much harder, much more durable. It does smell a bit like a farm for a couple of weeks, so it's definitely not for everyone. I would love to do that as a standard mix, but you've got to really be into it, I think, as a client.
And smells, when we're combining all these natural materials, I'm sure blood might have had a smell back in the day. But linseed oil, I think you said, that has a smell, doesn't it?
That definitely does, yes. And when it first goes in, it's pretty pungent. Certainly I have to wear a full respirator mask. It's pretty strong. It fades off over time. And then when we come and do the final wax, that kind of really seals it in. But for a while, yes, the smell of linseed is pretty prominent.
Can we circle back round on cost? How do we budget for this? Are there any tips you can give us?
Well, I can tell you currently, and it varies on sort of location around the country, we charge £160 a square metre for the top coat. So the 20mm top coat. And that is materials, labour, finishing, buffing, waxing. And yeah, that varies with the size of the floor and, again, the location. We're based in the southwest, and because of the trips out, I've got to come and wax, I've got to come and oil, I've got to come and install. There is quite a lot of travel involved, so it can affect the price. For people who are keen to do their own, we can offer the finishing, so the oiling and the waxing is done by the client, and that can save some money.
Should we start to wrap up on the earth floors? I suppose I was wondering about the contractor doing this themselves. Is that something you'd advise? You talked about the self-builder, or what are the benefits of coming to you, having done this for however many decades?
Well, the benefits of coming to us are that we know this material inside out, and we know what it can do and what it can't do. While the actual act of installing, I think people who are skilled with the trowel could probably install this product pretty well themselves. I guess it's the knowledge around it. Is a slightly different process than, say, doing another poured floor type. There is a bit more aftercare, and people do sometimes come a bit unstuck just because they don't understand the material. The last couple of years I've been running quite a lot of training programs I'm trying to make these floors as sort of widely accessible as possible. I definitely don't want to be the gatekeeper of them. I really believe in these floors. I believe in, if I didn't fully believe in them, I wouldn't be doing them. I think they have a lot to give, and certainly in terms of a poured floor alternative, the benefits are huge. And so, yeah, I'm really keen for as many people as possible to know how to do this. And I'd love to see them just be a regular floor that no one's sort of confused about, and it isn't weird and difficult. It's sort of common knowledge.
And do you get the impression that it is becoming more popular?
Well, I've seen lots and lots more architects being excited by them, and I think that's probably because of the embodied carbon aspect. Well, and maybe it's actually just kind of part of natural materials becoming more accepted and much more mainstream. They once were, certainly when I started, they were very much little hippie self-build things that only the super geeks sort of knew about, and now they're really branching out. And I think the work that people like Clay Works have done to really bring out clay plasters, I think very much we're feeling the uplift of that. People understand this material now, they're not scared of it.
And finally, is there anything else that should fit into this conversation, or anything that you want to recap?
So as a recap, earth floors, they look beautiful, they feel incredible under your feet. They're incredibly good in terms of embodied sort of emissions, and they work beautifully with radiant floor. And at the end of the product's lifespan, you can break it all up, chuck it in your garden, and it will break down to be just earth again. There aren't many products, certainly flooring products, where you can say that. It's key to remember the limitations, and the main one of that is being damp. You need to be on top of the moisture movement in your building. That will surefire damage an earth floor. So that is a definite limitation, and just having a good upfront plan of how the building's going together, how much time it's going to take, what you're going to do while the floor is, you can't walk on the floor for 3 weeks, a month. Do you know what I haven't said, Ben?
Go on.
So Sukita, my mentor and teacher, she's just released the second edition of the Earth Floors book. And on the front cover is an earth floor that I made. And I'm very, very proud of this fact, that I've gone from student of Sukita to,
Jedi Master.
Yes, but the Earth Floor book, so it's called the Earthen Floor book. And really, if anyone's interested to know more about earthen floors, then they should definitely read this book. It's got so many tips and techniques, goes through all the testing processes, all the oiling, all the finishing. And this second edition, they've brought in experts from around the world who have contributed things they've been trying, things they've been doing, things that have worked, things that haven't, lessons learnt. It's an absolute massive book of knowledge. And it's, the second edition, I got my copy and was instantly learning new ideas, and I've been installing them for 15 years. So that's definitely a thing you should look out for, and obviously admire the front cover because that's a beautiful floor.
Jeffrey, always fun to chat to you. Thank you so much.
Likewise, thank you.
Head online to take a look at the show notes for this session, houseplanninghelp.com/391. You can check out some of these floors and how they come together. We've also got a link to the Building Sustainability podcast, well worth digging into the archive there. You're going to learn a lot with Jeffrey. And if you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, we're knocking about on social media. Find out about the platforms which we're on. We'll put that in the show notes along with links to Jeffrey, and maybe even you'd like to be a customer of the Earthen Floor Company. It's all at houseplanninghelp.com/391. My call to action is to check out the Hub, and this is the membership community that we run alongside House Planning Help, offering further assistance best in those early days when you're just shaping your thoughts and working out what you want to do. You can always keep learning. Once you get into the trenches, it can be harder to check in and learn and interact and all the rest of it. But come and find out more. We've got courses in here. We've got Ask the Expert. We've got Office Hour. We've got the in-depth video case studies that we spent a lot of time filming on, live training with guest experts. Find out more, houseplanninghelp.com/join. That's it for today. Thank you so much for being there. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.